They said the altar was cold stone. But it was waiting. It had waited for nearly 100 years, buried beneath gardens no one visited, beneath a path no tourist walked, beneath Vatican soil that once drank blood and now only knew footsteps. Forgotten even by the faithful, it remained, silent, unseen, and undisturbed. Until the day he came. Pope Leo I XIV hadn't even finished unpacking his few belongings when he made an unusual request. Take me to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Not the press room. Not the papal apartment. Not the Sistine Chapel. The archives. The staff exchanged glances. No pope had ever gone down there so soon. Most never went at all. But Leo was not most. Born Robert Francis Prevost, his appointment had stunned the world. He was not a crowd favorite. Not a headline maker. He was American, yes, but quiet. Peruvian by mission. Obscure by choice. And then there was the name, Leo. No one had chosen that name in over a century. Not since Leo XIII, the Pope of mystery, of Marian dreams and ancient writings. Some had warned him. That name bears a burden. But Leo only smiled. When reporters asked him why he chose it, he gave an answer no one understood. Because his mission is not finished. No one dared ask what that meant. They were too busy trying to understand how a man who whispered in churches had suddenly been given the loudest voice on earth. And yet, within his first 48 hours as pontiff, Pope Leo descended, not into luxury, but into the lowest chambers of the Vatican archive. The archivist who accompanied him, a young Jesuit named Father Diego Amato, tried to hide his unease. The corridors were colder than he remembered. Deeper than he recalled. Lamps flickered along the stone hallways. The further they went, the quieter everything became, until even the sound of breathing felt too loud. We're looking for the restricted cases from 1878 to 1903, Pope Leo said softly. Diego froze. That's Leo XI's era. The Pope simply nodded. But those aren't theological records, Holy Father. They're personal, incomplete. Most were never translated. Again, only silence. Eventually, they arrived. A heavy, rusted cabinet bearing the faded label. Privata, Papae Leonis XIII. Diego unlocked it with shaking hands. The Pope reached inside and withdrew a narrow, black box. It bore no markings. Just an old wax seal and the Latin inscription, nearly invisible in the dim light. Ad altar silentiae. To the altar of silence. He carried it carefully to the reading table, where a single lamp buzzed above. No one else was there. No one else dared be. Inside the box was a letter. And a map. The letter was brittle, edges flaked with age, handwritten in ink that had bled through. The map was older, perhaps older than Leo XIII himself. It showed the Vatican gardens, but not as they were now. It showed something beneath. A chamber, marked only with a symbol, a chalice inside a flame. Leo's eyes filled. He closed the box. What was he hiding? Diego whispered. But Leo wasn't listening. He was remembering something. Years ago, while still a bishop in Peru, he had dreamt of an altar that glowed without fire. Of stone that whispered. Of a medallion broken in two, resting atop a forgotten slab. He thought it was just a dream. Until now. Take me there, he said. To where, Holy Father? Diego asked. The Pope turned the map and pointed to the spot where no flowers grew. Where even gardeners didn't go. There, he said. To the place he saw. To the place he knelt. To the place we buried and forgot. They left the archives in silence. But something did not stay behind. A whisper rose from the old cabinet. No one heard it. No one could. Except the stone. The altar had been waiting. And now it had stirred. It was a part of the gardens no one spoke about. Tucked behind rows of lemon trees, past the gravel path where tourists once strolled, through an iron gate rusted shut and long forgotten, it waited. The gardeners never trimmed that section. The ground stayed hard, dry, silent. Even birds refused to land there. But the map led him here. Pope Leo stood at the gate with Father Diego beside him. Neither spoke. The morning sun hung low, casting long golden lines across the earth. Leo held the map in one hand, and something else in the other, a rosary worn smooth from years of quiet prayer. Diego tried the lock. It crumbled. The gate creaked open. The earth was different beyond the threshold. Older. Heavier. Each step into the overgrowth felt like descending, not into a place, but into memory. There were no flowers. No grass. Only stone, veined with moss, wrapped in vine, cracked and uneven. In the center stood a low structure, almost buried, more like a forgotten tomb than a chapel. The map had called it an altar subterraneum. A hidden altar. Leo approached it slowly. The door was carved into the rock, barely visible. A triangle above the frame. 3 notches on the lintel. Inside, it was colder than expected. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of something untouched. Dust danced in thin shafts of light. The chamber was small, just large enough for a man to kneel, to bow, to be unseen. At the far end was the altar. Stone. Cracked. Uneven. But unmistakably sacred. And on it, resting like it had always belonged there, was the object from his dream. A medallion, broken clean down the center. Leo did not move for several minutes. He simply stared. It was as if time itself had folded in, and everything outside this place, Rome, politics, power, pageantry, ceased to exist. This was the only place that breathed. He stepped forward and knelt. Diego remained by the door, unsure what he was witnessing. He saw the Pope reach out and gently touch one half of the medallion. Nothing happened. Then Leo placed the other half. Still in his pocket, the one he had carried unknowingly for decades, next to it. The pieces fit. A single click echoed through the stone. No wind. No earthquake. No thunder. Just one candle, long dead, flickered back to life on its own. Leo whispered, not to Diego, but to the altar. "I am not worthy." No voice answered. Only the subtle shift of light, as though the air had thickened, with memory. He stayed kneeling. That day, no announcements were made from the Vatican balcony. No press releases issued. No interviews granted. The world expected a pope to act. But Leo chose stillness. The next day he returned. Alone. And again the next. And the next. Each time, something changed. The candle burned a little longer. The cracks in the altar seemed to heal. The moss on the outer stones began to fall away. One morning, he found a single lily growing from the base of the altar. No root. No soil. Just a lily, perfectly white. He didn't speak of it. Even to Diego. He brought only silence. And left only prayer. After 7 days, he placed the rejoined medallion in the center of the altar. Then, with trembling hands, he whispered a phrase only Leo XIII had ever written. Altar silentiae. Altar of silence. It was not a name. It was a summons. That same night, across the world, things began to stir. In a chapel in France, the tabernacle clicked open on its own. In a convent in Spain, a novice found a lily growing from a crack in the floor. In a hospital chapel in Brazil, an old priest saw light through a stone wall. But none of them knew yet. None of them understood. Only Leo. And the stone. He had found the place. Not where a pope is crowned. Not where power is wielded. But where heaven kneels. Where the silence is not emptiness, but invitation. They didn't know each other. They spoke different languages, lived on different continents, prayed in different chapels. But they each felt it, the shift. A tremor not of the earth, but of the soul. It began quietly. In a cloistered convent in Portugal, Sister Agnes, who had been mute for 15 years, rose during morning prayer and placed her ear to the tabernacle. She gasped. She had heard breathing. Not her own. Not imagined. Steady. Gentle. Alive. She fell to her knees, trembling. In the Philippines, Father Camilo, known for his eloquent homilies, stood before his parish to preach, but no words came. Not from fear. Not from illness. But because something in the room had changed. He stared at the crucifix. And wept. Mass continued in silence. And no one left. In Nigeria, Bishop Chukwuma, a man of discipline and decorum, found himself unable to process a single agenda item during a diocesan meeting. Papers blurred. Time unraveled. He excused himself, entered the cathedral alone, and knelt before the Blessed Sacrament. He stayed there for 12 hours. No one dared interrupt. In a seminary in South Korea, a blind student named Thomas began writing in his sleep. His roommate thought it was nonsense until the papers were translated. Latin. Ancient, precise Latin. Words he had never been taught. Redite ad altar. No light loci. Al est hic. Return to the altar. Do not speak. He is here. One by one they began to feel it. Not a miracle. Not an apparition. But a pull. A magnetic silence that entered rooms before anyone else did. A weight, sacred and full, settling on their shoulders, not to crush, but to call. They weren't prophets. They weren't chosen. They were just listening. None of them posted online. None of them published books. They didn't even speak to one another. But in quiet rooms and forgotten chapels, they did one thing: they knelt. It became their only meeting place. A communion without agenda. A gathering without voice. Just men and women who knew that something was approaching, and that it would not come through thunder. In Canada, a grandmother named Elsie whispered during the Rosary group, "It's not a revival. It's a remembering." In India, a child in a slum pointed to the sky during adoration and said, "So? The lights are waiting for us to kneel." In Ireland, an atheist professor walked into an empty cathedral and collapsed, overcome by presence. He had never believed in God. He still didn't know if he did. But he couldn't move. Not for hours. In Rome, Pope Leo said nothing. He had not spoken publicly since the day he visited the underground altar. He cancelled audiences. Refused interviews. Gave no addresses. But people began to gather anyway. Not to hear him. To be near the silence that followed him. When he walked into a room, conversations halted. When he passed by, birds stopped singing. When he entered a chapel, even infants stilled. And still, he said nothing. One evening, a cardinal slipped a note beneath the papal door. It read, "What are you doing, Holy Father?" The next morning, the note was returned. On it, Pope Leo had written a single sentence. "Heaven doesn't choose leaders. It chooses kneelers." That same week, without coordination or plan, tabernacles in 17 countries were opened, not by human hand, but by something else. Locks untouched. Doors wide. Candles relit. And in every one of those places, someone was already kneeling. By instinct. By grace. By invitation. They began to be known only as the Whisperers. Not for what they said, because none of them spoke publicly, but because the world began to sense them. They were in airports, praying silently. In office cubicles, touching rosary beads beneath desks. In hospitals, where nurses paused and bowed beside patients. In alleyways, where homeless men looked to the sky and whispered, "He is here." No conferences. No live streams. No merchandise. Just reverence. Just return. Just stillness awakening in places that had long forgotten what stillness meant. Back in the garden beneath the Vatican, the lily at the altar had doubled. The moss had thinned. And Pope Leo continued to kneel. He no longer brought books or papers or even prayers. He brought only his breath, and placed it before the one who gave it. It began in a parish most people had never heard of. A small stone church nestled in the hills of northern Italy, Santa Maria del Pietre. The priest was old. His hands shook during consecration. But on the feast of Corpus Christi, something changed. When he elevated the host, the choir behind him stopped singing, not from cue, but compulsion. No one spoke. No one coughed. Not even the children stirred. The silence that fell was not awkward. It was alive. The priest's voice caught. He whispered instead of proclaiming, "Behold the Lamb of God!" And when he did, some began to weep. No sermon followed. No recessional song played. People simply stayed, kneeling, blinking back tears, unable to leave. Word spread, not through social media or diocesan newsletters, but through something older. Presence. In Ecuador, a seminary rector walked into the chapel to find every seminarian prostrate. No instruction. No rehearsal. Just stillness. In France, a cathedral's power system failed. No lights, no microphones. And yet, the largest attendance in 10 years sat through a full Mass, in absolute silence. One bishop, puzzled by the reports, issued a directive. Silence after communion is to be reintroduced for spiritual reflection. But by then, it was too late. Silence had already returned. Not as policy, but as a person. In Mexico, musicians began leaving their instruments at the base of the altar, not knowing why. In Korea, a youth choir refused to sing one night. When asked, the lead vocalist replied, "We don't want to fill what we didn't create." A growing pattern emerged. Parishes that were once bustling with noise and production now filled with breathless quiet. Something ancient had re-entered the church, not a movement, not a revival, but a memory. It was as if the tabernacle was breathing again. And everyone could feel it. One monastery in the Swiss Alps removed every amplifier. Their masses became entirely whispered. Tourists still came. But not to take pictures. They came to kneel. In the United States, a Catholic high school turned off its PA system for morning prayer. Students remained silent afterward. For 40 minutes. In a gymnasium. No one knew why. The principal later said, "It felt like we were interrupting someone." Then, one letter began to circulate. No signature. No stamp. Just clean paper. Typewritten text. Mailed or placed anonymously in churches across the globe. It read, "Remove the noise. Restore the silence. He is not in the program. He is not in the performance. He is in the whisper. Let the sanctuary become sanctuary again. Let the altar breathe. He is waiting for stillness, not applause. Be still. Be small. Be nothing before the holy." From the altar. By the time the letter reached Rome, it had already been translated into 19 languages. When it landed on Pope Leo's desk, he simply folded it and placed it inside his breviary, next to a worn image of the Sacred Heart. He knew. He'd been reading it long before it was written. One day, a journalist managed to get close enough to ask him a single question. "Holy Father, what is this silence everyone is speaking of?" Leo smiled faintly. Then he raised his hand. And did not answer. The journalist never published the moment. She couldn't. She had started weeping the moment he turned toward her. She didn't know why. All she remembers is leaving her microphone on the altar and walking away. Across the world, adoration chapels filled like never before. Not with incense and music, but with hunger. Silence became sacred again. Not absence. Not nothingness. But presence, so thick, so real, that people forgot how to talk around it. One priest in Argentina wrote in his diary, "For the first time in my life, I am afraid to speak in God's house. Not from fear, but from awe. It feels like he's truly here. And I might miss him if I say too much." Children noticed it first. They would kneel without being told. Draw pictures of tabernacles glowing. Say things like, "Shh. He's sleeping here." Or, "Don't step near the gold box. He's watching." Parents laughed, at first. Then they began kneeling too. The silence spread like light in fog. Slowly, gently, but unmistakably. And it always came with the same signs. A hush before the host was raised. A trembling before the bells rang. A stillness after the final blessing that no one wanted to break. And always, the sense that someone was listening. In the garden beneath the Vatican, Pope Leo remained at the hidden altar. The lily had multiplied. 3 now bloomed. The medallion remained sealed at the center. He did not ask for miracles. He did not issue reforms. He simply knelt. And somewhere in the deep silence, so deep even thoughts had to kneel, he heard it. A breath. Not his. Not the wind. But the very breath of heaven. Waiting for a church that had forgotten how to listen. It happened on the 12th visit. The morning began like any other. No fanfare. No witnesses. Just Pope Leo descending the narrow garden path with his hood drawn low against the early fog. The air was thick with dew, heavy with the kind of silence that makes the heart beat louder. The altar beneath the garden had become more than a destination. It was now a threshold. He entered alone. The altar chamber had changed since his first visit. What was once dust-laden and crumbling had begun to pulse with quiet life. The moss had all but vanished. The walls, formerly cracked and jagged, had begun to smooth. The lily in the corner had multiplied to 5. No one had planted them. No one watered them. They simply were. Leo knelt at the foot of the altar. His prayer was not in words. It never was any more. He breathed, he bowed, he waited. And then it came. Not a fire. Not a wind. Not a voice. But something that could only be described as a flame without heat, a shimmer without color, a presence without shadow. It did not descend from the ceiling. It rose from the stone. From the altar itself. At first, it looked like candlelight, a flicker at the edge of vision. Then it sharpened. It hovered inches above the rejoined medallion. It did not consume. It did not move. It simply was. Leo opened his eyes. He did not flinch. He did not tremble. He just looked, not with curiosity, but with recognition. This was not new to him. He had seen it before. Once, long ago, in a chapel deep in the Peruvian jungle, during a midnight vigil with only a broken monstrance and a room of weeping lepers. He had seen this light. He had thought it a fever dream. But now, here it was again, real, unmoving, undeniable. The flame hovered. Then, gently, it bent toward him. Like a kiss. It did not touch his skin. It touched his chest. Right over his heart. And in that moment, he saw it all. He saw a church cracked with noise but bursting with grace. He saw priests who had forgotten how to tremble, and those who still did. He saw tabernacles left unopened and tabernacles glowing with light. He saw a generation of children who were being trained to perform, and a remnant who were being called to kneel. He saw bishops walking tightropes of politics while the saints hovered over catacombs, waiting for someone to remember what the church had always been. He saw lights in the east, weeping in the west, whispers rising in the global south, and silence returning to the north. He saw Eucharists handled like plastic, and others adored like fire. He saw himself. Alone. Kneeling. But not empty. Carried. Not by power. Not by the church. But by the flame. It lasted less than a minute. But when it vanished, Leo collapsed. His head fell against the altar. His breathing slowed. His robes soaked in the stillness of the stone. He did not move for hours. When he finally rose, his eyes glowed with something other. He left the chamber without a word. Father Diego found him later in his private chapel. Silent. Pale. But burning, not outwardly, but inwardly. His very presence had changed. That night, without explanation, Leo wrote a letter in his journal. It was addressed to no one. It would never be mailed. To whoever finds this. I have seen the flame that does not burn. It does not destroy. It remembers. It carries the memory of reverence, of holy ground, of sacred fear, so old, even the angels dare not name it. Heaven has not forgotten us. But we have forgotten how to kneel. The altar was never empty. We were. And yet he comes, not in wrath, but in waiting. I am not worthy. But I was chosen. Not to speak, but to kneel. Not to build, but to remember. If you are reading this, go to the altar. Not with words. With breath. With silence. He will meet you there. The letter was sealed and hidden in the chamber beneath the garden. No one would read it for years. But its truth began moving without ink. Because something had changed in Pope Leo. The world noticed. He no longer gave homilies. He only elevated the host. And when he did, the room held its breath. He no longer traveled. And yet nations began sending envoys simply to sit in his silent presence. He no longer governed. And yet, governance improved. Cardinals began resigning quietly. Some returned to their homelands to care for orphans. Others reopened shuttered seminaries. A bishop in France stepped down during a televised mass, kissed the altar, and walked barefoot into a monastery. He left only a note. The fire has touched him. I heard it through his silence. In Brazil, a Pentecostal pastor entered a Catholic chapel for the first time in his life. He left his shoes outside and stayed for 2 days without food or speech. When asked what happened, he whispered, I saw a man kneel and it lit something in me I didn't know existed. In Japan, a Zen master watched a live stream of Pope Leo's Eucharistic adoration. He wept. He sent a letter. You have touched the sacred. We call it breath. You call it spirit. Either way, it burns. No one had seen the flame. No one but him. And yet, everyone felt it. The altar beneath the Vatican began drawing quiet pilgrims. No signs pointed to it. No announcements were made. But people came. From everywhere. Often at night. Often in tears. They did not knock. They did not photograph. They did not speak. They knelt. And the stone never cooled again. There was no Vatican press release. No synod. No doctrinal declaration. No global council. But something in the church began to change. Not all at once. Not loudly. But deeply. It started in places no one watched. A confessional in Uganda that suddenly filled with men who hadn't been inside a church in 20 years. A chapel in Ireland where the priest removed his microphone and, for the first time, whispered the consecration. A mission church in Argentina where children stopped playing soccer mid-game, walked inside barefoot, and knelt before the tabernacle. No one told them to. They simply did. Something had shifted. Not revival. Not spectacle. But remembrance. People didn't know why they were crying during Mass. Didn't know why they were trembling at the sound of bells. Didn't know why they suddenly wanted to remove their shoes before entering churches. They just knew something holy had returned. Or perhaps, it had never left. In the Philippines, a teenager named Joaquin told his mother, "We can't play after communion. He's still here." No one had taught him that. In Sudan, a Catholic soldier at a frontline chapel broke down mid-prayer. His hands shook. His weapon clattered to the floor. He later told his commander, "It felt like I was seen for the first time in years. I didn't want to be angry anymore." The ripple spread through the hierarchy, not by command, but by conscience. Cardinals stopped campaigning. Bishops began confessing publicly. Seminaries reopened, not with numbers, but with silence. One Monsignor in Spain renounced his title and became a hospital chaplain. When asked why, he simply said, "Because I finally remembered who I kneel for." It didn't make headlines. But hearts knew. In Honduras, a man who had mocked the church for decades walked into a cathedral, sat in the last pew, and stayed for 5 hours. When he emerged, he was asked what he had seen. "Nothing," he replied. But he was there. In Canada, a homeless man began cleaning a parish floor every morning before anyone arrived. When the pastor thanked him, he said, "I used to sleep here. Then one night I woke up, and he was looking at me." Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Leo remained at the altar beneath the garden. He no longer kept a calendar. He no longer wore red shoes. He didn't even sign documents anymore. He simply listened. And the church, without a single official directive, began to return. The music changed first. Choirs stepped down. Organs paused. Silence became the offertory. People didn't want to hear voices. They wanted to hear him. Then the liturgy. Long pauses began appearing. Priests bowed more deeply. The Lamb of God became a whispered cry. Even architecture responded. Modern parishes removed their black box stages and recentered the altar. Churches repainted their walls. Not with slogans, but with frescoes. A crucifix was restored above every tabernacle. And the people? They returned. Not in multitudes, but in reverence. In Columbia, a mother brought her autistic son to Massachusetts. He had never sat still before. That Sunday, he dropped to his knees during the elevation and whispered, "He's shining." In Nigeria, a young girl drew an image during adoration, Christ with tears on his face, and crowds walking away. Her mother asked what it meant. She said, "They forgot he's real." But I didn't. In India, an entire village started attending daily mass again after a 9-year-old girl said she saw a flame above the altar. No one else saw it. But they believed her. Because everything in their hearts was beginning to burn again. It wasn't just in churches. The silence spilled into the streets. In Milan, a metro station went quiet for 10 minutes without explanation. In Los Angeles, an atheist artist stopped mid-installation and wept beside a crucifix in a museum, later confessing, "I felt presence. And it ruined me." In South Korea, a popular influencer deleted her entire platform and began living in a small cell attached to a convent. She never spoke again. In hospitals, before surgeries, some patients began asking for a priest, not out of fear of death, but out of awe. They felt watched. Not by nurses. Not by doctors. By someone. One woman in Ghana described it best. "It's like heaven is peeking through the veil, and waiting for us to remember." Pope Leo never called it a movement. He rejected every attempt to name it. One cardinal suggested calling it the New Eucharistic Awakening. Leo shook his head. "It is not new," he whispered. "It is the oldest thing we ever knew, and the first thing we forgot." In secret, he began writing something, not a speech, not a decree. A message. One that would never be spoken from a pulpit. One that was never meant to go viral. But one that would eventually break open the soul of the church like never before. He had seen the flame. And the world. The world was starting to remember the altar. The signs came quietly. No lightning. No thunder. No booming voices from heaven. Just the sound of heaven breathing through stone. It began with an altar in Ethiopia. During a quiet weekday mass, the priest noticed a hairline fracture on the altar, one that hadn't been there the day before. After mass, he traced it with his hand and felt heat. The altar wasn't breaking. It was opening. In Spain, a host shimmered during exposition, not just a glimmer under light, but a radiant glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. People thought it was a trick of the monstrance. But no metal flickers that way. In Argentina, a parish statue of the Virgin Mary began to weep. The tears weren't visible at first. Only the eyes changed. A young girl told her teacher, "She's crying without tears. Like moms do when they pretend to be strong." In South Korea, mid-homily, a priest stopped speaking. He paused for what felt like forever. When asked later, he confessed, "I heard a voice. Not outside. Inside. It said, 'Be still. I am coming in the silence.'" In Kenya, a tabernacle opened on its own during a night vigil. The candles lit themselves. No one touched anything. The crowd fell face down. In Boston, a modern church removed its crucifix years ago. One morning, a janitor found a wooden cross nailed into the altar by invisible hands. Security footage showed nothing. In rural Ireland, sheep refused to enter a particular field. For days. Until one morning, villagers found a buried stone slab in the center. Carved into it was a word in Latin: sacrificium. Sacrifice. One priest whispered. It's as if the land is trying to remember. In the Holy Land, a group of tourists stopped mid-walk through a first-century ruin. They said they heard singing, chanting in a language no one spoke anymore. But it wasn't frightening. It was inviting. All across the world, the signs multiplied. Crucifixes grew warm during prayer. Hosts refused to dissolve in mouths. Bells rang out at odd hours, with no bell ringers. Flowers began growing in concrete cracks near abandoned churches. Old Latin inscriptions became readable to children who had never studied the language. In Tokyo, an artist painting a Madonna and child dropped her brush. The eyes on her canvas had moved. Not shifted, looked at her. In Nigeria, a Pentecostal choir practicing outside a Catholic cathedral stopped singing mid-note. They felt watched. Not judged. Not threatened. But invited. The choir walked inside. And knelt. It wasn't just objects that changed. It was people. In Australia, a Protestant pastor walked into an empty cathedral, expecting to take photos for a lecture on symbolism. Instead, he dropped to his knees. He hadn't prayed in decades. He left 3 hours later shaking. There was no one else there. But someone was. In Germany, a group of teens filming a prank video in a church suddenly froze. The footage was never posted. One of them later said, "It wasn't fear. It was like, I didn't want to breathe wrong." In Chile, a secular journalist covered a story on returning reverence in the church. During her interview with a local bishop, her recorder stopped working. But the silence kept recording. The audio, played later, revealed 40 seconds of what sounded like heartbeat and wind. She converted 3 days later. The Vatican remained silent. No confirmations. No denials. But the people already knew. Something had happened. Something was happening. Even the skeptics noticed. Even the critics. A prominent atheist podcaster visited a cathedral in London just to debunk the hype. He never recorded the episode. He left without shoes. And never explained why. Then the phrase began. Whispered first by children. Then elders. Then by people in places where no one believed. It showed up in letters. In journals. On the lips of those who had no reason to say it. He is here. Not he will come. Not he might return. But he is here. The same phrase. All over the globe. In different tongues. Same sentence. Same moment. In Brazil, a dying woman whispered it while receiving her last Eucharist. In Poland, a priest shouted it mid-homily and fell to his knees. In Uganda, a blind boy said it during the Our Father, and his mother fainted. In Rome, a child scribbled it on the steps of the Apostolic Palace. He is here. It wasn't dogma. It wasn't doctrine. It was declaration, and not from man, but from mystery. And the world began to remember the silence again. They had seen the signs. But the signs weren't the miracle. The silence was. Because only silence could carry a truth that heavy. And only silence could prepare them for the message that was about to come. He never intended it to be read. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't an encyclical. It wasn't even titled. Just ink on paper, words poured out in silence, sealed within the Pope's private journal, meant for no one but the flame that had once touched his chest. But heaven had other plans. The message was written on the 33rd night after the flame appeared. The papal secretary found the pages tucked between Psalm 46 and John 6 in Leo's personal breviary. They weren't marked. They weren't labeled. Only the handwriting gave them away. The secretary read it once, heart pounding. Then again weeping. Then, without permission, he copied it by hand. He didn't know why. He only knew it wasn't for keeping. He left it on a kneeler in a side chapel. By dusk, a bishop had read it. By dawn, the world had. The message spread not through websites or news. but through hands. Printed. Folded. Whispered. Photocopied and slid into hymnals. Mailed to convents. Left on hospital bedsides. Tucked into confessionals. And it always began the same. You were not forgotten. You were not passed over. You were always being called back. The altar is not a platform. It is a threshold. It is not a stage for performance, but a table for presence. He never left. We stopped kneeling. He never stopped calling. We just replaced silence with sound. The church is not dying. She is remembering. Not another movement. A return. Not another noise. A stillness. Not another campaign. A cry. The flame does not consume. It reveals. The breath does not deafen. It purifies. To the priest, your hands were not given for function, but for reverence. To the bishop, your crozier is not for parades, but for shepherding trembling souls. To the mother, your kitchen can be an altar. Feed your children like Christ fed the multitudes. To the father, kneel once a day in your home. That is enough to crack open heaven. To the child, stay close. Your innocence is prophecy. Do not wait for miracles. They are already breathing beside you. Do not build towers. Build silence. The tabernacle is not empty. The candles have not gone out. He is here. It was signed with nothing. No name. Only a small, simple mark. The impact was immediate and irreversible. In cities, people gathered in churches just to read it aloud. In villages, entire congregations stayed silent for hours after hearing it. In prisons, inmates wept over photocopies, tearing them into strips and wearing them like scapulars. In classrooms, teachers replaced lectures with adoration. And in Rome, Pope Leo remained silent. He did not confirm it. He did not deny it. He didn't need to. Because by then, every bishop, every priest, every child who had ever stood before a tabernacle already knew. The message had not come from one man. It had come through him. And it had awakened something ancient. Not excitement. Not emotionalism. But awe. The kind that silences rooms. That melts cynicism. That makes grown men tremble and mothers cover their children with prayer. The kind that rewrites the heart without using words. The kind that tells the church, you forgot how to kneel. But he never stopped waiting. He died without announcement. No Vatican alarms. No camera crews. No breaking news. Pope Leo I XIV passed into eternity the same way he had lived his final days, in silence. They found him at dawn, beneath the Vatican gardens, in the hidden altar chamber. Kneeling. His head bowed. Eyes closed. Lips slightly parted as if whispering, or listening. The medallion lay before him. The lilies around the altar had multiplied, 12 now, perfect and white, growing from stone. He died as he had prayed. Still. Reverent. Unseen. Known only to God. There was no state funeral. No grand procession. Per his request, no papal vestments were worn. No choirs sang. Instead, bishops from every continent gathered in silence, barefoot, in the underground chamber. They knelt in the dirt, cardinals, patriarchs, monastics, even skeptics. Some wept. Some trembled. None spoke. The only sound was wind moving through the garden above, as if heaven itself exhaled over the altar. His body was laid to rest beneath the stone, no tombstone, no inscription, only a small bronze plaque engraved with a single sentence. He never left. We just forgot how to kneel. After his death, the world did not erupt. It quieted. For reasons no one could fully explain, mass attendance rose globally, but without spectacle. Confession lines doubled, but without preaching. Eucharistic adoration became the heartbeat of cities. In classrooms, teachers began setting aside moments of silence without being told to. In neighborhoods, families began lighting candles and praying quietly before meals again. Without hashtags or challenges. In parishes, people began arriving early and staying late, not for announcements, but for presence. The change was not broadcast, but it was everywhere. In South Africa, a Protestant man walked into a Catholic church he once mocked and wept in the back pew for an hour. No one spoke to him. In the Philippines, a 4-year-old knelt before the tabernacle and said, "He doesn't want us to clap. He wants us to come close." In Peru, an old woman, who had never traveled more than 20 miles from her village, whispered to her granddaughter, "The church remembers now. I can die in peace." In a prison chapel in Ukraine, 20 inmates spent an entire night in adoration. When guards checked the security cameras, they saw nothing unusual, just men in orange jumpsuits, unmoving, kneeling in perfect stillness. One inmate wrote on the wall, "No priest. No sermon. But he was here." And the church began to change, not from top down, but from altar out. In dioceses, bishops gave up their limousines. In seminaries, silence returned to the halls. In cathedrals, pews filled with people holding no phones, no agendas, just open hands and bent knees. Choirs sang less, but hearts swelled more. Sanctuaries became sanctuaries again. The church remembered her first love. Not because of strategies, but because one man knelt where others built stages. One man chose silence where others chose applause. One man chose to listen, and in doing so, reminded the world that God never stopped speaking. There was no second flame. No spectacle to follow. Only a quiet ripple of holiness that outlived headlines. Pope Leo was not canonized. He was not even declared venerable. But in the hearts of the faithful, from back alley chapels to grand basilicas, his name became something different. Not a title. Not a legend. But a memory. A man who heard the breath of heaven and fell to his knees. And reminded the church how to do the same. And now, we remember. The cracked altar that began to glow. The flame that did not burn, but revealed. The message no one meant to share. The silence that spoke louder than thunder. The breath that returned to the tabernacle. And the church. The global, wounded, restless church. Finally remembered how to kneel. He is gone. But the flame did not leave with him. It lingers, quiet as breath, gentle as dusk, waiting in the corners of chapels, rising like incense from cracked altars, hiding behind the trembling hands of priests, resting in the silence between notes of every sacred song. It burns not in fire, but in memory. Not in spectacle, but in stillness. This was never about one man. It was about what one man remembered. That presence does not perform. That holiness does not shout. That God does not demand crowds, He invites kneelers. So now, the flame passes to you. Not to carry loudly. Not to wear proudly. But to guard quietly, like He did. If you find a place that feels too silent to be sacred, stay. If you feel a breath that is not yours beside the altar, listen. If the world demands a noise, answer with a whisper. And if you ever feel forgotten, just return to the place He did. The altar. Where everything waits. Where everything begins. Where everything returns. He is here. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who has forgotten how to kneel. Someone who needs to remember that silence can still speak. And that holiness never left the room. Subscribe for more sacred stories that awaken memory, not just minds. Leave a comment below, just one word. Kneeling. So the world knows you heard the whisper too. And if you feel called to sit before the altar today, even for a moment, go. He is there. And so is the flame.